On the 29th of April 2011 at Westminster Abbey in London, history happened. A young woman, descended from working-class miners, married a Prince of England. Catherine Middleton, her face and story has since been broadcast throughout the world. And yet, in 1464, almost 547 years before this date, a woman of low background married the King of England. Her story has since faded away into historical nonentity, and her name is somewhat lucky to have a paragraph in historical books of the period. However, in this documentary, I will be examining her life. Who was she? Where did she come from? And most importantly, what happened to her? Did her magical fairy tale end happily ever after? Or did she, mother of the Princess of the Tower and grandmother of Henry VIII, live to regret her royal match? Elizabeth Woodville was born around the year 1437, but the precise date remains unknown. Her own birth was shadowed by scandal. Her mother, Chiquette of Luxembourg, had been the daughter of Pierre, Count of St. Paul, and her ancestry was described as from one of the most prestigious houses in Europe. In 1433, 4 years before Elizabeth's birth, Chiquette had been married to the Duke of Bedford, one of the most powerful men in England at the time. This arranged match made Chiquette not only sister-in-law to the former King Henry V, but aunt by marriage to the present King Henry VI. However, 2 years later, and with no children produced from the marriage, Bedford passed away, leaving Chiquette as a widow, and a powerful one at that. In February 1436, she was granted a dowry on a condition that she would not marry again without the king's permission. Yet only a year later, she was begging for a royal pardon, having married Sir Richard Woodville, her late husband's chamberlain. Though the Woodvilles had proved their loyalty to the king, their background was terribly modest. Richard's ancestors were not from the prestigious house themselves, but the Woodvilles had held lands in Northamptonshire since the 12th century. The shamed couple were pardoned on the 24th of October 1437 after paying a fine of £1,000, a massive sum in those days. Once the fine was paid, the couple were once again in favour with the king. Elizabeth, perhaps unaware of the drama of her parents' marriage, spent her early years at Grafton Manor, where she was soon joined by her brothers Anthony and John, as well as her sister Margaret. Out of her 14 siblings, these 3 were closest to her in age. Grafton itself was a substantial village located on the road between Northampton and London. Throughout Elizabeth's childhood, her parents had a limited part in her upbringing. At the age of 7, as part of custom, Elizabeth was sent to live with another landed family. Though there is no clear evidence where she went, it has been suggested that she was sent to Groby Manor in Leicestershire to live with the Grey family. In her teenage years, she was first betrothed and then married to Sir Edward Grey's eldest son, John. Her life as Elizabeth Grey would not last long. In 1461, during the Second Battle of St Albans, John was acting as Queen Margaret's captain and was in charge of the Lancastrian cavalry. Though the battle was a victory for the Lancaster faction, John Grey was slaughtered, alongside 2,000 to 4,000 others who died that day. A widow at 23 and the mother of 2 small children, Elizabeth fled back to her father's house at Grafton, whilst her mother-in-law, Lady Elizabeth Ferrers, seized her dowry lands. After the Battle of Towton in 1461, the royal dynamic of England had changed drastically, with the head of the Yorkist faction, Edward IV, as king, and the former King Henry imprisoned, with his queen and son in exile. The Woodvilles, as key Lancastrians, had all of their property confiscated by the new king, but he then pardoned Richard a month later and returned their property 2 months later. What happened next would be the defining moment in Elizabeth Woodville's life. In a short time, the knight's daughter and the knight's widow would become the wife of the King of England, no less. Tradition has it, the 27-year-old woman, holding on to both of her son's hands, was waiting at the roadside near Grafton under an oak tree for the king. It was there that the young widow pleaded with the king for the return of her lands. Thomas More later described the king as being attracted to Elizabeth, but she was fair but smart. The cool way in which Elizabeth was said to have played with the king, refusing to give herself to him as his mistress, only enamoured him further, and he proposed to her. In early May 1464, the couple married in secret in a small chapel hidden in the woods, with only Jacquetta, the priest, and trusted servants as witnesses. After 5 nights together, Edward left to join his army in taking down the Lancastrian rebel forces in the north. Historians have debated Elizabeth's motives behind the marriage for years. Her family had naturally lost considerable influence when the House of Lancaster was overthrown. Some experts attribute her to falling in love with the king and marrying him for love. Others, however, cast her as conniving and overreaching. After all, a marriage to a king was something that a knight's daughter could only dream of. No English king had married a commoner since 1066. The match brought with it no financial or political benefit. To her contemporaries, witchcraft had to be the only answer. In years to come, Elizabeth and her mother would be officially accused of casting a spell on the king at least twice. But witchcraft, though a simple solution to the issue, was not the only aspect Elizabeth had on her side. Her beauty was well chronicled. Though medieval society distrusted powerful women, they valued beauty, for it meant good, whilst deformity meant evil. She was a strong character, and her fertility was proven by 2 healthy sons. Perhaps her links with the Lancaster faction could, in theory, unite the warring factions, or so it was thought. Margaret of Anjou was a continental bride, and her political alliance with the old king had only caused more trouble. Times were changing. There was a new king after all. Why couldn't there be a new queen, an English one at that? Though they married in May, it was not until Michaelmas Day in September of 1464 that Edward declared Elizabeth as his wife. This revelation was a shock, perhaps most of all to Cecily, Duchess of York and Edward's mother, and to Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Before her husband's death, Cecily had assumed the state of a queen. Now, the daughter of a knight would take precedence over her. Warwick, the kingmaker, had aided Edward's journey to the throne, and it was Warwick who arranged an Anglo-French match for Edward. Plans crumbled to dust. Warwick would no doubt have resented the new queen. Not then certainly afterwards. Barely a month into her marriage, and then the Woodville marriages began, with Elizabeth's siblings being married into the nobility class. Perhaps the most controversial was when John Woodville was married to Catherine Neville, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk and Warwick's aunt. The match on paper does not sound controversial, however Catherine was most certainly a wealthy widow. To top it all off, she was elderly, her age ranging from 60s to her 80s, not your typical bride for a young man at the age of 20. However, these events were overshadowed by Edward throwing an extravagant coronation for Elizabeth in the May of 1465. Apart from the king himself, the only other notable absence was that of Warwick, away as a diplomat in Burgundy. A lucky consequence perhaps, or maybe a lucky escape. On the 11th of February 1466, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. In the following years, Elizabeth had 2 more daughters, Mary and Cecily. Though medieval royal birthing was difficult and overly ritualized, Elizabeth never complained. For all the negative views on her, she has never been criticized for not abiding by convention. Other than just procreating, Elizabeth also became a patron of learning, and she used her influence to support Queen's College in Cambridge. However, the rise of the Woodvilles led to the rise of yet more trouble. Alleged arguments between the Woodvilles and other nobles and gentry led to accusations against the Queen's family. However, these problems seem rather trivial for what was to come next. The rise to power of the Woodville family had brought with it more powerful enemies. One in particular had made a king. Now he planned to bring this king down along with his wife and her family. Once again, the cousins' war would ignite. Warwick was nearly 40, but he felt replaced by the new, younger generation who were winning positions through merit rather than blood. His hope for an Anglo-French alliance was torn to shreds time and time again. It was all too much. Richard Neville returned back to his estates in the north and began to plot. The timing was good. By 1469, Edward's subjects were more than a little disappointed with the government's failures. People were complaining of paying for pointless taxes. Warwick's obvious distancing from the court signalled him out as a potential leader of the opposition. In both April and June 1469, two uprisings occurred in the north of England. The growing strength of the rebels caused defeat for Edward and his troops. In the confusion, Warwick turned against him and married his daughter Isabel to Edward's younger brother George, Duke of Clarence. With her daughters at Norfolk, Elizabeth was perhaps unaware or not that concerned with the uprising. However, this was all to change. After the defeat at Edgecote, Edward was intercepted on his way back to London by Warwick's forces. Warwick was now de facto master of England, with the king in his custody. He had the recently captured Richard and John Woodville, Elizabeth's father and brother, beheaded outside of Coventry on the 12th of August. News of their deaths would have reached the Queen barely a few days later. But Warwick couldn't cope with the troublesome nobility and gentry, and so he released Edward. Rather than punishing the man who had murdered his in-laws and imprisoned him, Edward forgave him alongside his brother. Here was the man who murdered her father and brother, but yet simply forgiven by her husband. However furious Elizabeth was, she kept herself collected. Revenge would have to wait. Though forgiven, Warwick no longer held the intimate position of power from the early days of Yorkist government. Frustrated once more, he didn't have long to wait for the next round of trouble. In March 1470, Edward was riding north once more to put down another rebellion. Warwick and Clarence were sent to raise troops. It soon became clear the minds behind the rebellion, and a furious Edward ordered Warwick and Clarence to return to him. Instead, they fled by ship to France, where Warwick allied himself with none other than Margaret of Anjou, in an agreement where he would help to restore Henry VI to the throne. Edward was stuck in Yorkshire, defeating rebels when the Lancaster forces led by Warwick, Clarence, the Earl of Oxford and Jasper Tudor landed at Plymouth on the 13th of September. Realising fighting was futile, Edward fled the country and journeyed to Burgundy. Her husband gone and enemy forces heading in her direction, Elizabeth began to provision a tower for a siege. However, the rebel forces were far too strong, and so with her mother and 3 daughters, the heavily pregnant queen fled to Westminster Abbey for sanctuary. Henry was released and restored to the throne, perhaps more than a little baffled at what was going on. At the beginning of November, within sanctuary, Elizabeth gave birth to the anticipated son at last. In April 1471, Edward and his forces rode into London, from where they landed in East Anglia, and they successfully retook the throne and recaptured Henry. Outside the town of Barnet, just outside of London, his forces defeated the Lancastrian, and Warwick was slain. The victorious army then marched to Tewkesbury, where on the 4th of May they defeated Margaret's forces and slaughtered her son Edward. Top Lancastrian nobles, in a way similar to Elizabeth, had been taken sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey, where they were dragged out and executed. Edward may have been forgiven beforehand, but this time round he was ruthless. In London with her children, Elizabeth's troubles were not over yet. A rebel force from Kent attacked the capital. The Londoners fought them off for 3 days before the king's forces could arrive. Elizabeth herself was at the heart of the action, residing as she was in the Tower. The return of Edward to London to popular acclaim signalled the end of one of the most dramatic periods of English history. In 25 months, one king was disposed by force, but yet managed to reclaim his crown and recover his kingdom. It has been suggested that this time brought the best out in Edward, but yet it also brought out the best in Elizabeth. Her dignity was not faulted even when she was under attack or hidden away in seclusion, but now with her son in her arms and her husband at her side, she must have felt very powerful indeed. For the next 12 years, life would be peaceful for the royal couple. Edward's rival, Henry VI, died soon after Edward arrived back in London of mysterious causes. His widow Margaret returned to France and lived simply until her death in 1482. But times were not always perfect during this period. In 1472, Jacquetta died. She had been a key influence of Elizabeth and a pillar of support in troubled times. Her death was a significant loss for the Queen. Another issue with the period was the clash between Yorkist brothers. In the mid-1470s, Clarence once again began to cause trouble and became entangled in a plot of treason. Rather than forgiving him as before, Edward had him executed privately in the Tower, famously rumoured to be from being drowned in a barrel of wine. Clarence was a nuisance. His clear resentment of his brother's authority and his reckless behaviour with Warwick had only just been forgiven. His execution, however, was an extreme and rather rash action. Elizabeth was naturally blamed for influencing Edward. Perhaps her anger at Clarence for his part in her father's death had yet to be extinguished. However, Edward had the final say and his decision was resolute. With Clarence gone, a serious contender to the throne had vanished, and the royal couple would most certainly feel safer in the knowledge of his death. By 1483, the couple had been married for 19 years and had 7 healthy children alive and well at the time. This would be the year that the peace was shattered. At the end of March, Edward sickened. He died on the 9th of April, just days before his 41st birthday. Suddenly, the throne of England was vacant. All that stood in the way were 2 boys, aged 12 and 9. Immediately, the major players sprung into action. Elizabeth ordered her brother Anthony to bring her son Edward to London, whilst Gloucester took control over the Council of Regency. Gloucester and his ally Buckingham met Anthony and Elizabeth's sons, Richard Grey and Edward, on the road. Here, Gloucester arrested Grey and Anthony on charges of treason. In London, Elizabeth's attempt to raise an army failed. Elizabeth and her remaining children once again fled and took sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Upon Gloucester's arrival in London, his focus changed to securing a second son, Prince Richard. Elizabeth still held the prince with her in sanctuary and refused to let him go. Gloucester's swift accusation and execution of Edward's friend Hastings only proved his ruthlessness further. Soon, the sanctuary was surrounded with soldiers. Within the sanctuary, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the other lords pleaded with Elizabeth to surrender before Gloucester would remove Richard by force. Elizabeth argued back, saying that as Richard's guardian she was not obliged to surrender him. But with the story of Hastings' demise still hanging in the air, she had 5 daughters to think of as well as her eldest son. Little Prince Richard was handed over to his uncle and sent to the Tower to join his older brother. Once Richard was in his keeping, Gloucester ordered the executions of Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey, Elizabeth's son from her first marriage. Allies of Gloucester began to publicly question the legitimacy of the new King Edward due to the secrecy of his mother Elizabeth and his father Edward's marriage, as well as the fact that Edward was already pre-contracted to another woman before his marriage. Legitimacy was a grey area when it came to succession. William the Conqueror was famously illegitimate, and yet he still was King of England. Either way, Gloucester was crowned King Richard III on the 26th of June. Elizabeth and her daughters remained in sanctuary, but the 2 princes vanished within the Tower. It has long been suggested that Gloucester had them murdered, but he was not the only one that could be rewarded with their deaths. Whatever happened to the boys remains a mystery to this day. The son she had birthed in sanctuary was gone. The second son she tried to shield was gone. Elizabeth was desperate. She soon found herself involved in a plot with the remainder of the Lancaster faction, headed by Henry Tudor, the son of Margaret Beaufort. The rebellion, however, failed miserably. In January 1484, Elizabeth's dower was removed as well as her title. From then on, she would be known as Dame Elizabeth Grey in reference to her first marriage. Life in sanctuary was crowded and uncomfortable. In March 1484, King Richard swore on holy relics to not harm Elizabeth and her daughters, and so the family left sanctuary. The older daughters soon joined the royal court. Princess Elizabeth was especially beautiful, and rumours soon surfaced that she was to become Richard's wife after his sickly wife, Anne Neville, died. The public was scandalised, none more so than Margaret Beaufort, who had arranged Princess Elizabeth in marriage to her own son. In 1485, the wheel of fortune was once again going to spin. Henry Tudor's small army, comprising of the remaining Woodville brothers and Thomas Grey, landed at Milworth Haven. The Lancaster forces and York forces clashed at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. Richard was slaughtered, and Henry Tudor became the new King of England. Later that year, Elizabeth was restored to the title of Queen Dowager, and the Act against the legitimacy of her children was repealed. On the 18th of January 1486, Henry married the Princess Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey. Their first son, Arthur Tudor, was born on the 20th of September, with Elizabeth acting as godmother. However, in 1487, Elizabeth was deprived of her properties and confined to Beaumont Abbey. Her crime? She was said to have imperialised Henry's cause by surrendering her daughters to Richard in 1484. It was a silly excuse to use, and most historians agree that the real reason was the rise of a rebellion by the pretender called Lambert Simnel. Henry had suspected Elizabeth was behind it, perhaps due to her involvement in plots against Richard. Henry's biggest influence, however, was his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Her dislike for Elizabeth was well known, and it must have been gratifying to see her rival being moved away from the spotlight. Elizabeth's final years were spent quietly at the Abbey with her youngest daughter, Bridget. On the 8th of June 1482, she died. In life, she had lost 5 brothers, 6 sisters, 4 sons and 2 daughters. The former queen, a woman risen so very high from her humble upbringing, was conveyed by water to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where she was buried next to her husband, Edward. Her impact on medieval society was clear. Her surprise marriage changed the political landscape, and whilst forming links, also broke powerful ones. The reignition of the Cousins' War, led by the rebellious Warwick, seems largely to do with his resentment to her rise and influence. By all accounts, Elizabeth Woodville was not a popular figure in the period in which she lived. Problems in Edward's reign were largely blamed on her and her family. But in modern society, historians look on her in a kinder light. Though not born to the role, she did by large fulfill it. Even her story, the basis of a woman of low birth marrying a royal, is portrayed nowadays, whether in books, movies, or just young girls' dreams. The marriage of Prince William to Catherine Middleton only pulled more interest onto this legend. Elizabeth's story, her rise and falls, her loves and losses, has long since been pushed back into the background, but her legacy still lives on.